This is Grafted Together with ACSI Chief Ministry Officer Jerry Nelson.
The great theologian and philosopher Francis Schaeffer once said, "There are certain unchangeable facts which are true. These have no relationship to the shifting tide. They make the Christian system what it is. And if they are altered, Christianity becomes something else. This must be emphasized because there are evangelical Christians today who, in all sincerity, are concerned with their lack of communication, but in order to bridge the gap, they are tending to change what must remain unchangeable. If we do this, we are no longer communicating Christianity, and what we have left is no different from the surrounding consensus," end quote. The great theologian Karl Barth also said, "Take your Bible and take your newspaper and read both, but interpret newspapers from your Bible." Our guest today has certainly taken up this cause as he has sought to communicate the unchanging message of the gospel in the midst of a great paradigmatic shift. Hi, I'm Jerry Nelson, and this is Grafted Together. My guest today is Dr. Matt Daniels, who is the Distinguished University Professor of Law, Political Science, and Human Rights at Anderson University in Anderson, South Carolina, a Christian university. Matt is the founder of Good of All, an international public education movement dedicated to promoting universal human rights in the digital age. His content has reached over 50 million people online in a variety of languages, English, Spanish, and Arabic, using edutainment methodology of student-created content developed in partnership with the founder of Disney Interactive. Dr. Daniels is also the creator and producer of www.universalrights.com, a YouTube channel dedicated to promoting universal rights through entertainment, content created by students at Good of All's global network of academic centers. And how I came into contact with Dr. Daniels was through his book, Human Liberty 2.0, released by Simon & Schuster, which showcases the inspiring stories of teens and adults channeling the power of digital social media to advance the cause of human dignity and universal rights in the world. And Dr. Daniels' pioneering work on the application of universal rights principles at the core of Dr. King's work to the forces of hatred, division, and violence in the digital age have led to the creation of the K-12 curricula published by McGraw-Hill Education, and what I'm really excited about, the Share the Dream Church curricula, which is published by HarperCollins Christian. And most recently, Dr. Daniels launched a campaign with several dozen NBA players adding their voices to the chorus of support for teaching Dr. King's gospel-based principles as an antidote to the forces of division and violence. And this campaign has averaged 71 million views a day and will soon expand to the NFL later this year. I can't think of someone more qualified to speak to the issues that we are facing today, and someone who has really sought in a very intentional way to bring this unchanging message of the gospel to this current generation. So welcome, Dr. Daniels.
Thank you.
Well, as we have talked over the last few years, there is a growing tide of disunity within our nation. Obviously, that's spilling out over to the world. But, you know, in this space of Christian education, I hear from a number of heads of schools. Obviously, much of this was accelerated during the COVID time and everything that happened during 2020. But there is still this feeling that, you know what, we haven't gotten over the hump. Things feel like they're actually getting worse. And so I want to kind of start there. You know, from your perspective, what is it that you're seeing as someone who has fought on the front lines of division and really tried to bring a solution? What are you seeing in our culture that's contributing to this division? And, you know, and talk a little bit about what you are doing specifically to address those issues from your vantage point.
Well, I'll say to you something I said to Andrew Young when I first met with him. He, of course, has become one of our champions for this educational initiative.
Mm,
It's important to look at our situation today through the lens of history.
mm,
I'm a student of politics, and I am somebody who understands that people don't change from age to age, people are the same.
mm,
And so the patterns of politics tend to repeat. I would say to you, the bad news is that we are approximately where Germany was in the 1920s. Okay, if you want the big picture, we are Germany in the 20s. We are going through a cycle of polarization that inevitably leads to violence. And the secular forces that are at work will continue to accelerate that polarization because it fuels their business models, it fuels their political ambitions, and ultimately it fuels the goals of spiritual darkness.
mm,
The Lord put us here to disrupt that polarization with a vision of a better world and a better society, to lead people out of that trap. 100 years ago, the German church did not do a good enough job when confronting this dynamic, and the result was very bad. The good news is that America is much better off than Germany was 100 years ago.
mm,
We have everything we need to help America find its way down a better path. And I think the best place to go is, it's not the only place to go, but I think it's the best place to go, is Dr. King.
mm,
He offered our nation transcendent principles rooted in the gospel that saved us from terrible bloodshed in the American South. You know, the American South should have been Rwanda, but
mm.
it turned out differently thanks to the sacrifice of Dr. King and other courageous men and women, most of them believers. We need to deploy those principles again today, and we can if we're willing to embrace them actively and offer them to a society that's in grave peril.
You know, I appreciate you and just our, I think what we've determined to be our common heritage, and that we both are students of politics. The economist Frederick Hayek wrote quite a bit. He was an economist, but he did talk about the polarization in his economic principles in the book Road to Serfdom. He talked about the polarization that took place in Germany. You know, the ironic thing that has happened, especially in the 1990s with Derek Bell. Derek Bell seemed to introduce this whole idea of which has become a very popular, this critical theory, where he sought to discredit the principles that were employed during the civil rights movement. And obviously, this has kind of caused a new division, if you will. So on one hand, it seems like you're saying that we need to go back to MLK, his principles. He saved us from a lot of bloodshed, which should have been Rwanda. But Derek Bell comes along and says, no, the civil rights in general was a failure. And I'm sure in your work and as you're advancing this, you have heard a lot of these criticisms of Dr. King. Can you respond to that and why you believe that Dr. King's principles are the way to go?
Well, the first thing to say, sure, the first thing to say is they're really actually not Dr. King's principles, they're the Lord's principles, right?
Mm-hmm.
They work and have power because they're transcendent, and they originate in the heart and mind of the living God. Mm-hmm. So what Dr. King did was he contextualized for the American situation in the 60s principles that both the substance of his teachings as well as the tactics that he employed were rooted in the gospel. Let's talk for a moment about the tactics. Okay, so we are watching a rising tide of violence. You're going to see more of it at both extremes. Mm-hmm. Violence has a certain logic, and it's always the same. It's what I call the 3 Ds: demonize, dehumanize, destroy. You can do this with race. You can do this with social class. You can do this with tribalism, as they did in Rwanda, tribal differences. You can do it with religion. But it's always the same dark logic. The cure to disrupting those 3 Ds is to emphasize the dignity of all people made in the image of God. Whether you believe they're made in the image of God or not, if you can get your mind around the fact that people have dignity, they have fundamental rights, they're not things, then you can begin to disrupt those dynamics of destruction. So Dr. King used that principle of human dignity, which, by the way, is baked into our founding documents, inalienable rights, which are the birthright of all humanity. And he essentially called upon America to honor its founding promises and apply them to all people. So he used the original founding vision of our nation, rooted in the transcendent, to lead us out of what would have been otherwise a very bloody history in the South. Dr. King's principles are unifying. They're rooted in a love for God and a love for people. They are obviously, they lead to a philosophy of nonviolence. And by the way, why nonviolence? Well, if people are made in the image of God, then it's wrong to use violence against them, even if they're trying to kill you. This is sort of the way the early church dealt with the oppression that they faced. They did not reciprocate. And that disrupts the dynamic of darkness. What you have with, modern secular theorists who are critical of King, and there's lots of them, okay, on the right and the left, by the way, is a search for a paradigm that is rooted in human thought, often human philosophies of class consciousness and class warfare. And inevitably, those philosophies focus on what divides us, right? You could be focused on race, you could be focused on social class, but it's all about group division, and then asserting the rights of one group over another. And unfortunately, it does not lead to peace and harmony. It leads to more division, as you might imagine. The cure is to emphasize what we have in common, which is our human dignity.
And so I want to kind of double down on the point here. So if Dr. King's principles are rooted in the gospel, then it's okay if the messenger itself was somewhat flawed, if we can take the message itself and say, no, this is gospel based. We can't discredit the message on the basis of what the life of that individual may have been. Is that an inaccurate?
Well, yeah. Let me just be very practical and direct. Okay. Most believers read the book of Psalms. The book of Psalms was written by David. What we know David did is far worse than anything MLK has been accused of. Okay. I would submit to you, if you're going to sit in judgment on any individual like Dr. King and reject his teachings, then you really need to stop reading the book of Psalms if you're going to be morally and spiritually consistent. But then you have a further problem. Paul quoted David extensively, and so you're going to have to stop reading the Pauline epistles. Then you have a further problem. Jesus Christ, God incarnate, quoted David. And so you're going to probably need to stop reading what he had to say. And then when you're done, you won't have any basis for your moral and spiritual litmus test. So might as well just face the logic of the fact that all people are sinful, flawed, and broken, but God uses them anyway. He did with David, he did with King. Hopefully he'll do that with us.
And good word. So I know that's been a big issue. And I know there's been, as you mentioned, on both the left and the right, of a lot of prominent evangelicals who have come out against Dr. King. But I as someone who has labored on the front lines, if there's any concern about what Dr. King, preached, I think it's important that apologetic is shared, especially within our evangelical communities, especially our school leaders who are going to be grappling with this come this fall, with the beginning of this election cycle, this very divisive election cycle.
Yeah, well, let me just say this. One of the reasons I have hope for America is because we have been given so much to work with
Hmm.
that was not available to the church 100 years ago in Germany. Um, People need to understand, as believers, we have to have a narrative of rights. This is very important. I'm astonished, actually, that a lot of well-educated leaders in K-12 in Christian education don't seem to understand this. Let me just frame it properly for you, okay?
Hmm.
There is something called the digital divide. The digital divide is very real.
Mm.
It operates in interesting ways depending on the topic. But let's talk for a moment about morality and issues of justice. So around the world, among what the group that we call digital foreigners, people born before the internet, um, whether they're Jewish, Christian, Muslim, Catholic, evangelical, they all speak a moral language of religion and theology. Okay,
Mm.
the moral lingua franca, or common language,
Hmm.
of the group that we call digital natives, young people born after the internet, is rights. The moral lingua franca of the future is rights. If you do not have a rights narrative, okay, actually, let me pause. This is why darkness packages all of its most cherished ambitions in rights language.
Mm.
Whatever the topic is, they're always packaging it in rights language because they are speaking the moral lingua franca of the young.
Hmm.
If we do not have a moral rights language, we forfeit the entire culture, the future, and the next generation. And that is what we have been doing, particularly in the white evangelical community. And we have no right to complain that the culture is turning against us because we forfeited it. Now, good news. We have a wonderful rights narrative rooted in the gospel, in the teachings of Dr. King. The history of that movement that changed this nation and changed history itself is our story. It's the story of the gospel. And we've got to teach our young people to proudly share that story as an expression of their faith with their peers. And that's how we turn the tide. You cannot hide from this culture. You cannot run from this culture. You cannot build a subculture enclave and hope that you'll withstand the tsunami that's coming. You have to go on offense for the good.
You know, this reminds me again. I open up the podcast here with a quote from Francis Schaeffer, and Schaeffer says the exact same thing. He gives the analogy of Hudson Taylor going over to China. He's like, it would be foolish if Hudson Taylor just came with his own understanding of the dialect. He's like, no, it's very important for him to understand the dialect of where God was leading him. For him to be able to communicate well, he needed to be able to translate. Is that exactly what you're saying? That we need
Yes.
to really understand, and how does that understanding come about? Let's get a little practical. The if there isn't understanding, how does that understanding take place? How does the modern evangelical leader here in America begin that process of understanding this new lingua franca?
Well, I think part of it, it's kind of like the witness of the early church. Part of it is you sort of experience and encounter the authentic original rights narrative as expressed in the lives of people who, were on the front line. So let me tell you my little journey here. When I first met with Andrew Young, I asked him, I said, how did you do it? I mean, how did you overcome the violence, the threats, the monolithic legal, social, cultural opposition that you faced in the South? And with characteristic humility, he said, well, there weren't many of us. We were young. Some of us were pastors, but our churches were small. So we had to rely on the Spirit. So I said, well, give me an example. He said, well, we'd be planning to go to place A for a rally, and someone would have a dream the night before telling us to go to place B. So, in obedience to the dream, the next day we'd go to place B, and there'd be a bomb at place A that would have taken out the whole leadership of the civil rights movement in its infancy. When that happens to you, you learn to be led by the Spirit. And I realized, wait a second, you were the early church. This is actually like hearing the history of the early church, a group of marginalized, powerless people up against the world who could have only overcome by the power of God. There is no explanation for what they achieved apart from the power of God. That is our history. It has been taken by the world, hijacked, and weaponized, in some cases, weaponized against people of faith. That's our story, our history. And if we don't teach it to our children, we have nothing to defend ourselves against a world that's becoming increasingly violent. And we have nothing to offer that world in terms of a better way.
So speaking of that better way, let's pivot to the work that you've done to try and actionize this passion that God is put in your heart. You know, obviously at the top, I mentioned about your work with human liberty. I remember we kind of joked about that early on, and how I really appreciated it, of the work that you put into that. But I remember you said it's not necessarily something that you recommend to everyone to read. Is that
Yeah.
is that correct? But it's still good for those of you who really appreciate just the dynamic work that young folks are doing, positive work, to elevate human rights. I definitely recommend that book. But let's pivot in two parts. I want to talk about the work that you've done in the K through 12 area as it relates to Dr. King, and really sharing those principles. And then I want to also pivot to the work that you're doing in the church realm, in your Share the Dream curricula. Can you talk about both of those?
Yeah, so the first step in this journey was to work with Andrew Young and a colleague of mine who's a believer and the chair of the HBCU committee of the College Board, to create curricula for the McGraw-Hill platform. The curriculum is called Civil Rights, A Global Perspective. It teaches Dr. King's principles. It then seeks to encourage young people to apply those principles to the challenges of our world today, using the tools of digital media, which can be used for good or evil and are tremendously powerful. They weren't available, obviously, in Dr. King's day, but they are available to us today. So we try to pass the baton to a new generation. We don't just teach this stuff as dead history. We have a 6th grade curriculum and a high school curriculum. They're both full semester elective courses available on the McGraw-Hill platform. They both have the same title, Civil Rights, A Global Perspective. The 6th grade version is keyed to national and state reading standards. The high school version is keyed to history and social studies standards, although depending on the state, it is also keyed to character or civics standards. About 50% of the schools that teach these courses teach them as standalone one-semester electives, and about 50% teach them as part of an existing curriculum where they take elements of the course, and either is fine with us. Both have been endorsed by a wide range of groups like Focus on the Family, like the Colson Center. ACSI has been supportive. We've seen CISA, Council for Educational Standards and Accountability, endorse them. So there's a pretty good list of endorsers who vetted them. And we found that everywhere we go, once people actually try them, we get a positive response. There's really nothing in these curricula to be afraid of. There's no Trojan horse, no hidden anything. It's simply the unifying, inspiring, transcendent principles that animated our founding, that animated the work of Dr. King, and that ultimately are rooted in the gospel.
You've also had some endorsements from major school boards as well. Can you name a couple of those?
Well, we've had the doors open to us in a whole bunch of states across the country. The organizers of the largest MLK parade in the nation, Colorado, have embraced and endorsed our curricula. We've been embraced by commissioners of education and state boards of education in blue, red, and purple states. We actually won an award recently from the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education for innovative curricula. So, the nice thing is we're not in a box. We don't really have any agenda other than trying to teach the unifying principles of Dr. King. So once people are exposed to our material, as opposed to thinking in terms of, a caricature or a stereotype, we do well, and we're going to, I believe, increasingly do well, because the world needs an antidote to this terrible cycle of division and violence, which is only just getting started. I mean, I have to say this, the bad news is it doesn't get better quickly. If you're a student of politics, you know that social change, if it's meaningful and enduring, doesn't happen overnight.
No,
we didn't get here overnight, and we don't get out overnight. But if we start with a long-term approach, a holistic approach, we can turn the tide.
Let's pivot to your church curricula, the one that's being published by HarperCollins Christian. Let's talk about that and who you've worked with to produce that.
So I got the vision for the church curriculum during that meeting with Andrew Young, when I realized that I had never really heard the real history of the civil rights movement. The real history of the civil rights movement is actually a spiritual history that's been somewhat covered up by or ignored by the world. I recruited a friend on the board of the Conference of National Black Churches to help me create curricula that have since been put on the HarperCollins Christian platform. They're also being co-published by UMI, which is America's largest Black church publisher. And they've racked up a wonderful array of endorsements. We announced the launch of that church curricula on the 60th anniversary of the I Have a Dream speech at Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta. The staff there have been incredibly supportive and encouraging. It's a 6-week study, 6 videos plus a study guide. The website is sharedream.org, sharedream.org. And it's designed to fit the 6 weeks between the MLK holiday and the end of Black History Month. That you could teach it anytime you want, but that's what it targets. HarperCollins has designated the Sunday before the MLK holiday as Share the Dream Sunday. And so for the next decade, hopefully, they will be offering that to churches. I personally think white evangelicals need this as much or more than the Black or Latino church, because we have unfortunately neglected teaching about justice in favor of emphasizing evangelism, discipleship, and personal piety. Those are all good things. The problem is, if you look around you at the culture, we need a narrative of justice, because that's what young people want. Their hearts yearn for that, and they will get a narrative of justice from the world if we don't give them one that's rooted in transcendent truth.
Indeed. Just a point on that. Barna just did a 3-part survey on what they call the open generation. And it was a 3-part series, one that had to do with teens' view of the Bible, teens' view of Jesus first. That was volume 1. Teens' view of the Bible, and then teens' view of justice. And what's interesting is the percentages that came out of that. And this was the largest survey, I believe. It's unique of its kind, where they surveyed somewhere around 25,000 teens between 13 and 17 around the world. But what was most intriguing out of this survey was the high percentage of teens that reported back being what they would consider to be justice oriented. Like there are more justice oriented teens throughout the world today, and this corroborates what you're saying in terms of the language, than Bible engaged. So it's interesting. And so I think, to your point, just thinking about the Barna research itself, the gospel narrative, in a sense, needs to rise to the top, because if we only have about 8% of Bible engaged, and then you have 23 or 24% of justice oriented, therein lies the problem. It's the wrong narrative. Who is filling that gap? And so it just really drives home the point that, first of all, of the opportunity that exists here, that we elevate a biblical narrative, a biblical portrait, and we translate that not in a way where we're changing the meaning of the words, but we're translating it in a way that the current generation understands the unchanging principles in this changing tide.
And let me just focus quickly, because it's maybe helpful for your audience, on one of the central elements of the hijack of the rights tradition that we've been talking about. Dr. King succeeded because he had a message for all people, right? Mm-hmm. He didn't have a message for any one group. He had a message for all humanity, made in the image of God. He has been distorted by secular leaders into a black rights figure. Mm-hmm. And that is why, if you ask a high school student today, what was Dr. King about? The typical answer that you'll get is, oh, black rights in the 60s. I mean, that could not be more wrong. That's like saying that Benedict Arnold was president. You have it entirely backwards. He would have failed if his message had been for one group of people. It's a universal message for all humanity, and that's the message that we have to reclaim.
Great word, Matt. Out of our 4-year relationship, it's like fine wine, and it just continues to get better over time. And my prayer, even from the beginning when we met, there's few relationships or few conversations that start off in such a way, just like, I think this is really going to be an enduring relationship, and just to watch how God has blessed you in this area, your passion for this. And I think I can go on record and say you have had success because your feet have been planted in the right place. It's been planted and rooted in the gospel, and God is really giving you an opportunity to share that. And my prayer, especially for our listeners, our heads of schools, or whomever may be listening, is to embrace those transcendent truths of the gospel, to make sure we teach an accurate picture of what the gospel is, an accurate understanding of Dr. King and his principles. And as Matt has said, is a message for all people. It's not just a message for Blacks or the oppressed or what have you. It's a message for all people, and it's a unifying message. Well, thank you, Dr. Daniel. Oh, you got one more comment? Go ahead.
Well, yeah, I was going to say, I want to talk about the opportunity. I think about this all the time when I think about students in Christian schools. In the pre-digital era, the way that you communicated ideas was through like a figurehead or a spokesman, right? So you had FDR, you had Mussolini, Hitler, Dr. King. And that's because there was an era of media monopolies, right? Okay. We're living in an age where the media monopolies have been toppled, and every single human being has the potential, as you are doing with this podcast, to be a powerful voice in the culture. Let's just imagine for a moment, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of Christian young people, Black, brown, white, and yellow, all inspired by the transcendent gospel principles that animated the incredibly successful work of Dr. King. Imagine having them unleashed in digital and social media as voices. That's how we turn the tide. There is no other way to turn the tide in this culture. That's what Christian education should be all about.
Yeah. I feel like we need to do a follow-up podcast about the visionary capacity of economists, because I immediately thought about Lexus and the Olive Tree. Oh goodness, the economist's name is slipping my mind, but he predicted what he called the democratization of communication, where everything was going to begin breaking apart, and it was going to be more localized rather than centralized. And I read that book when I was in college, so over 20 years ago. So, I mean, it's amazing to see that come to fruition. So it is a great point, and one that I hope the opportunity I hope that we harnessed as a body of believers. So, Dr. Daniels, thank you so much for your time. And
You're
I look
welcome.
forward to us being able to continue this conversation.
All right. God bless you.
All right. God bless you.
Grafted Together is a presentation of the Association of Christian Schools International. Learn more about biblical worldview and spiritual formation at acsi.org/graftedtogether.